remember really Van Graan going into a game under as much pressure and with as much scrutiny on him. That was very much the context ahead of Saturday night. Probably something we saw reflected in his pre-match interview as well with Murray Kinsella.
Yeah, very much so. You could see he was quite touchy and defensive. I think he's obviously acutely aware of the criticism that rained down in Munster, and particularly himself. I think he's become more of an open target now with the news that he's moving on to Bath, and probably didn't do himself any favours by saying he's looking forward to going to such a great rugby city, given he's coming from Limerick. And then the performance against Connacht, which had been coming in many respects because they'd relied on that pick and jam one-off runners to bully their way to even though early bonus point wins this season. There's been a couple of one-off performances as they were against Scarlets away with something of a cobbled-together team, and again against Wasps with a very much a cobbled-together one-off team. And they played with great freedom on those two occasions, less so on other occasions, particularly not against Connacht, with that kind of those 6 penalties in a row, tap and go, and 3 of them against 14 players. And apart from one advantage play when they went wide to Andrew Conway, it was just a sequence of 20-plus pick and jams followed by one-offs, and it just looked so easy to defend against for Connacht, and it passed the initiative over to Connacht. And what little rugby that was played that night was entirely played by Connacht. They fully deserved the win, so they had to come back with something. I think it's a huge win for them because, yes, can you imagine what the fallout would have been if they'd lost last weekend against Ulster?
Fiona, I think if I was being criticised publicly from all quarters, I'd be tetchy too. So I can understand the human side of where Van Graan's head was at in that pre-match interview. However, I'm not sure if that's the best approach for him to take for the next 5-6 months. Like, Murray Kinsella asked him about the move to Bath, for instance, and he said, I've spoken to that before, I'm not going to answer that tonight, it's all about Ulster. And then he was asked about the recent performances. He said, well, we just lost last week, and the previous week we won before that, Murray, if you care to remember. So I think on both counts, he could have very easily steered that a different way. I mean, it struck me, even the Bath question, he said he'd spoken about that before. I haven't really heard him speak about that before. I'm not going in to read the transcripts of Munster press conferences. I mean, given that everybody was at home, and I'm sure RT would have had an audience of at least 200,000, and more importantly, maybe the 30, 40, 50,000 people who routinely go to Thomond Park across a season, I would have thought that's a perfect chance to say, look, I leave with a heavy heart. I've got to do what's best for me, for my family. I know the people of Munster will understand, but trust me, nobody's more dedicated than me for the next 5-6 months, and steer it that way. But I don't think he was in that headspace at all to be, I suppose, a touch more strategic or clever with the media.
No, Joe, I don't think so. And you know what, it was actually funny because it was at the game, but I'm in a few, obviously, rugby group chats on WhatsApp, and my phone started going off about the interview before the game started at all. But obviously I hadn't seen it because I was up at the game with my dad. So it was only when I got home I looked back over it, and I thought it was very strange indeed. And it was actually a lot of Leinster fans that were sending me the text saying that they thought it was absolutely disgraceful the way he was speaking to Murray Kinsella at times as well. His attitude, I think he changed his tune after the game. As Gerry had said, he did face a lot of criticism. I suppose ex Munster players coming out and saying, maybe it's time for him to move on and as such. And even though like coaches probably say they don't listen to that criticism, I'm sure it was in the back of his head, and he was probably feeling, I don't know, you could see he was a bit on edge. But I do think after the game he's probably a bit more softer, and we saw a softer side to him. But I certainly didn't think it was great. I mean, 5,000 people absolutely freezing up in Thomond Park, everyone watching at home. It would have been a great time for him to just throw it on the line and say, look, I'm moving on, but I'm here and I'm going to put my best foot forward till I'm gone. I'm going to give everything in the role. So I did think it was quite strange.
Yeah, because Gerry, this was not, Murray Kinsella was not taking an extremely tough line of questioning and saying, well, how can you concentrate on Munster if you've got one eye on Bath and, maybe it's time to step aside. These were very open, fair, routine questions, I would say. Your assessment of Van Graan and the media generally, I'd have him as a fairly, and I mean this in a good way almost, like a fairly forgettable performer, and that he's always fairly measured and doesn't get himself into hot water generally.
Yeah, definitely, very much so. And he's always very polite normally as well. And, he's forthcoming with his answers. They're generally much longer than that. He's not noted for his brevity. That was quite a brief answer. I think to cut him some slack, Joe, what he meant by saying, look, I've spoken about that before. I mean, I've been asked about that before, and I've consistently said I don't want to talk about that when I'm here at Munster. And if you go through all his press conferences, every time he has been asked about his contract position and whether he's going to renew or not, and when he had it, he's always been very consistent in just playing a dead bat. It's just not something he wants to discuss in the public domain. I think to cut him a little bit of slack, that's what he meant. And he wasn't going to suddenly change tack 10 minutes before a derby at Thomond Park a week after losing a derby and suddenly go into his reasons for moving to Bath. So while it was a perfectly legitimate question for Murray to ask, I think that's where he was coming from. And yeah, the one about a few disappointing performances you worried about Munster's form, that was a tetchy enough response to say that, well, actually, yeah, we lost last weekend, but we won the weekend before. I don't think he did himself many favours in that pre-match press interview with Murray, but I think, in fairness to him, that's where he was coming from. It's not something he would ever wants to discuss publicly. He wasn't going to change tack now.
And they're very good points to make, I think. I don't want to nitpick overly. It was just a very eye-catching exchange. And I do have sympathy from Gerry, because I do suspect he feels the mood has turned, that there's this combination of, well, you're leaving us anyway to go to Bath, and the performances are still so turgid, to use maybe the word Keith Wood used last week. So that's a bad combination for him, and I'm sure he's aware of that the winds have changed.
Yeah, I think so. And as interesting in all of this, Joe, is that his own change of heart, because this is a man who was offered a 2-year deal and signed the 2-year deal before then activating the clause to leave with 6 months' notice. So he had a change of heart himself. And you're right, he hasn't explained why. Maybe he will one day. But it would be interesting to know the exact reasons. Munster is probably not the easiest coaching job in the world. There are a lot of disparate forces behind the scenes between the CEO, the Professional Games Board, and this group of private backers, the 10-14 club, who proportionally half financed the signings of R.G. Snyman and Damien de Allende. I would venture that he maybe finds they're too interfering, or maybe he's not happy with the fact that it looks like Damien de Allende is not going to be re-signed, and maybe R.G. Snyman neither, and he would have liked both of them to be re-signed. I don't know, but it would be interesting. There's clearly a lot of things going on behind the scenes in Munster. All is not what it seems. Like, he clearly loves the Munster job. He has loved working with Munster. That's evident. And yet he's now had a change of heart that he wants to leave Munster to join a team that are bottom of the table in the Premiership. Why? That tells you that all is not right behind the scenes in Munster, in my book anyway. I'd say it's a tough job. You've got the baggage of history, and the demands are very high there. And he embraced this all along, and now suddenly has had a complete change of heart and is walking away. I don't entirely agree with Peter Stringer's assessment that this shows that his heart's not really in it anymore. He doesn't want to be there. What little I do know about Johan van Graan, I don't know on a personal level really at all. But what I do know from talking to people is that he's a very honourable man, and I would be amazed if he doesn't see through his contract at the end of this season. And I would venture that his heart's still very much in it, and he will want to sign off as best he possibly can. And ditto Stephen Larkham. The problem is, if you got rid of Johan van Graan now, who would you replace him with? Would you replace him with Stephen Larkham? Well, he's leaving at the end of the season as well. And then if you remove Johan van Graan, you're a coach light on the ticket as well. I would argue that probably causes more upheaval than anything else. In one sense, at least, he's being honourable and he's given them 6 months' notice and he is moving on. At no point did he say, I'm staying, when he wasn't. Unlike his predecessor, Rassie Erasmus, who did say repeatedly, yes, 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 I'm staying, when all along he already knew he was going back to South Africa. Yeah. So you should bear that in mind as well. And
Gerry, that's a very interesting point you make. Just to expand on it for a moment. So it's your understanding or your contention that behind the scenes, Munster is a more complicated, maybe slightly more dysfunctional beast than the other provinces? Yeah, I would say so, Joe. I would be very, very, very surprised if Leo Cullen or Stuart Lancaster have any outside interference upon them. You know, let's say they're very much given a free hand to select, pick, coach the team. They have a specialist there, and Guy Easterby looks after contracts. I would venture that it's a smoother running machine, more harmonious off the pitch. Munster is. And you're talking there about the group who privately raised the money for the marquee signings. Yes, exactly. I think that when you have a body like that, they perhaps might want more influence on things that would be necessarily healthy. Fiona, what do you hear about Munster behind the scenes, if anything? Beg your pardon? I was asking Fiona, what do you hear about Munster behind the scenes, if anything?
Yeah, well, no, there's I wouldn't hear much about stuff like that. Obviously, I know there is money gone in from outside that 10-14, and I understand that, and I would imagine if there's people heavily invested in that, they then, I suppose, would seem like they have a right in certain in when they find issues, or they would bring issues to. So for a coaching staff, I would imagine it is hard when you're trying to concentrate, especially now when there's other stuff going on in the media outside. I would imagine it could be quite hard. I think there was something also said in as well, wasn't there, over in South African TV? Victor Matfield was heard saying something, a couple of things about maybe outside influence that he had relayed that to him. And also, I think there was a comment on Leinster get all the good players, which I thought was absolutely crazy, seeing as they're probably all from, a lot of the players are born and bred in Leinster anyway. But I know there was a couple of things said on South African TV, and I think he's been asked about that as well, but there hasn't been any comments made about that.
Yeah, Matfield relaying a conversation he said he'd had with Van Graan. I'm sure Joey Carberry crossed several people's minds when we heard that. And Gerry, just the last one, because it's all very interesting. The workings of rugby are often less apparent than football clubs, which are more straightforward, because we're talking about centrally contracted players, and the IRFU have a big say in things. As I understand it, the IRFU will have the majority say in who the next head coach is. Are the IRFU pleased, displeased, neutral when it comes to Munster relying on private money to fund the likes of Diolande, or are they perfectly happy for Munster to go and raise money like that privately?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that to some degree, these talking to people, that the RFU regard Munster as a little bit of a problem child. And I think that, for many years, Gareth Fitzgerald served there as CEO, and he had a magnificent way of pulling all the different strands in Munster together and making them feel that they all had a big major say in how things were being done. When in actual fact, he was generally calling the shots at the end of the day. He was, I think, that more with each passing year, the late Gareth Fitzgerald, Lord rest his soul, his presence as CEO will be missed more and more. I'm not saying Ian Flanagan's doing a bad job. I don't know in good work, but it's just a very difficult organisation to put it all together. And I think Gareth was a master at that. I'm not sure. Munster have got their financial issues that everybody freely talks about. They still got that stadium debt, which looks like a real liability for the union as well. They've been bailed out in the past. I don't know whether they will be again. They certainly wouldn't be capable of signing the likes of RG Snyman and Damien Diayende were it not for private backers, given their financial position. And they have been a little bit unlucky, because Snyman, has played so little rugby in the last 2 seasons that he could have been a Will Skelton type figure for them. We've seen glimpses of it. Imagine if he'd just stayed fully fit for the last 2 seasons. As the same with Diayende, who's been a brilliant signing for them when he's played, and he's played regularly for them. So, yeah, it's. I think the IRFU certainly will have the final say in who the new head coach will be. David Nucifora will have the final say in that. I don't know who will go about identifying it within the Munster setup. I believe the chairmanship of the Professional Games Board has changed recently, and there's an interim chairman there at the moment. So it's not really clear who's really calling the shots there. But I do think Nucifora will have a big say in who the head coach is. The head coaches in all the 4 provinces, Joe, are employed directly by the IRFU. Yeah. They are IRFU appointees, and contrary to the IRFU, the assistant coaches are hired by the provinces. I don't know if that's necessarily the best system in the world, but that's the way it works.
Yes. And isn't that why we almost have a system whereby, even though you would look at Leinster and say, well, Leo Cullen's a director of rugby and Stuart Lancaster's the head coach, the RFU don't employ director of rugby, so Leo's the head coach and Lancaster, whatever his title is his title. These are the kind of weird machinations that go on.
Yeah, it's interesting how Munster move forward from this. Do they need a head person over the head coaching ticket, like a director of rugby? Like, could the load on Van Graan have been eased by some kind of figure like that? And would they benefit from a Gaisubi type figure just to look after contracts as well? Quite possibly so. I think this might well be part of the whole. This is an opportunity now when they come over the next 6 months, when they devise a new coaching ticket, to maybe devise a slightly remodeled structure as well.
Mm. And a last one for me, and then we'll go to Fiona, who can lead us on the actual rugby on the weekend, bring her extra expertise there. But this is all very interesting. Would it be the case that Leinster, Connacht, Ulster would privately finance players as well? Like, I seem to have memories of certain deals being done with businesses to keep certain players at Leinster or to fund their contract in part. Like, that's the private investment is across the board, or no? That one's for you, Gerry. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, that's for me. But yes, there is private investment across the board. I'd venture that it's slightly done differently. It's more upfront in terms of when Leinster, say, and the RFU re-signed Johnny Sexton, it was obvious that Dennis O'Brien the deal with Johnny becoming an ambassador for, I think, was it Aer Lingus and so on and other things. So that it's sweetened in that sense. They got private backing for the actual facilities in UCD that they moved into, the new state-of-the-art facilities. That's where they got their backing. And most of these private investors like to stay fairly low-key. That's the way they prefer it. But yeah, there's a degree of that going on behind the scenes with all of them, no doubt.
Okay. Fiona, to the rugby. So you were in the stadium. I don't know what conditions were like. It looked treacherous pre-game, and then it calmed down for a while, and then seemed to be messy enough at times during the game. Rob Herring scores a try in 8 minutes, and then Simon Zebo sent off. That's alarm bells then, I would think.
Yeah, definite alarm bells. The first 20 minutes in general, I thought Munster were very poor. The decision making, discipline was rolling off the back of last week's loss to Connacht. There was some things, they weren't very cohesive. There was a lot of kicking the ball away again. But I think after Zebo sending off, maybe 15, 20 or about 5 minutes after that, I think things started to settle down. I thought Jack Crowley settled into his role. Yeah, he kicked straight into the touch or straight out for a line out back in the 22 in the first maybe 10 minutes. And I thought, his nerves were going to get him, but I thought they settled down and obviously had to pull together after that Zebo. So conditions weren't as bad as they looked, because I actually rewatched the game when I got home that evening, and being up there was quite chilly, but the wind wasn't as bad as I've seen in Thomond Park before. So definitely wasn't conditions. Bit of rain, but nothing too hectic.
And Fiona, when you say bad decisions being made by Munster in the first 20 minutes, what kind of things jump out to you or irk you or strike you as bad decisions?
Yeah, just similar stuff like penalties they were giving away, not rolling away again. I think even just general play, they kept it really narrow. I was on the opposite side of the stadium and they were over at the right, and there was so much space on the left, and they were one out runners again in the middle of the park going off on their own. Coombs went a couple of times, other players, and there was just so much space. And as I said, the wind wasn't that crazy and they just didn't seem to exploit that space at all. And the one time I suppose it did come out the wing, and I think Zebo, maybe I looked, he'd been down just before that. It looked like he maybe was getting a finger pushed back in, jumped up to his feet, came in then slightly after that with the high tackle. So just discipline in general was very bad, and the tightness of rugby that they were playing. They weren't, we talked all week in the media about maybe that, they weren't trying things we'd seen them do earlier in the season with the young guys playing. The team sheet looked exciting, and for those first 20 minutes it was very, very narrow, one out roars, and hopefully the game went on and we saw a bit of a change in that, definitely in the last 20 minutes of the game anyway.
There was a point at some stage in the first half where Munster were camped in the Ulster 22 and they kept going one-off runners and narrow, and Donald Lenihan certainly on the TV commentary was saying that Mike Haley is screaming for the ball out wide and there's so much space out wide. Now Fiona, I've seen, I was once Eddie O'Sullivan did a presentation for us at a roadshow on tactics, and he was explaining when you get in so close to a try line, it's perfectly fair to just keep picking and jamming, because if you start passing back you lose so many metres, and eventually if you keep picking and going you'll get over the line. So there's a real argument for it, and yet I think all of us would love to see the ball be flung out wide to Mike Haley and to show a bit more ambition in those moments, and it feels like Ireland even have started to do that of late. What's your perspective on that? You were in the stadium, you would have had a good bird's eye view of the space that was or wasn't available. Yeah,
picking and going is, completely. I do a lot of that work with my own teams, right? And obviously with the ball carrier, the biggest thing is you need to be square. You need to be making ground. You need to be carrying hard but square. And I found at times Munster were picking and going from the side and they weren't squaring up when they were going into that contact. And that's fine, right? And you can keep doing that, and they were getting knocked back and back. So I think it comes to a stage where your whole aim is perhaps to either go forward, nice and square, get ground, go over the try line, or else you're trying to suck that defence in. And I felt like they did suck the defence in at times, but then they just didn't have the vision to then get it out to the backs, who were absolutely screaming for the ball. So I don't like having policies as a coach, but in general, I'd tell my pack they'd have maybe 2, 3, 4 pick and goes, and if not, and they've created that defensive narrowness, the 9 needs to get it out and give the lads a shot out wider.
So you used the word vision there. It can't be vision, because there's only 5,000 in the stadium and the backs are screaming and you've time to look up. So it's a decision. It's not that they're not seeing those players out wide. They're actually deciding, let's keep doing what we're doing here. So it's like an inherent kind of pragmatism or even conservatism, let's be honest.
Yeah, definitely too conservative. I mean, it's definitely too conservative. And you know what? Actually, when I was looking at it in that first half, I was thinking back to the Connacht game, and I thought to myself, surely they've worked on this from the end of the first half in the Connacht game. Surely they've looked at this video. They've looked at how they're running. They're squaring up, maybe popping out a little bit further, maybe getting the forwards having a couple of steps before they take on that ball. And it just seemed to be very, very similar to that Connacht game. Yes, they were getting ground at times, but they eventually got to exactly like you were saying, where they got that goal. They had 2 or 3 quick consecutive picks and goes. Ulster defence came in nice and narrow, and there was just absolutely nobody that caught Craig Casey. Wasn't pushing forwards out of the way to get it out wide. They just seemed happy to keep doing the exact same thing over and over.
Yeah, because Gerry, we're talking here like Munster lost and they didn't, so it's worth stating that ultimately they do go wide in the second half for Haley's try, and ultimately they do win the game with 14 men. I suppose the moments we're analysing there with Fiona, and it's very interesting to get her perspective, they're the moments that almost worry you as the season progresses, that conservatism will come back to bite Munster on the bigger days.
Completely and utterly. That is the thing. And that's why even when they were racking up the bonus point wins at Thomond Park against South African opposition early in the season, it was nearly all through this tactic, one-off runners now and pick and jam. And look, you're right, it's not a black and white case. It's not an exact science. Leinster are uber efficient at this one-off drives as well, and pick and go and getting over the line, not least because they've got such an array of dynamic front rowers and strength to score from close range. It's yielded a bucket load of tries for Gavin Coombs already in his fledgling career. And in fairness to Craig Casey, he went wide once to Andrew Conway in that siege before half-time against Connacht, just that Jake Heen covered the ground that time, whereas Michael Larry left himself with too much ground to cover for the Mike Haley try. For me, though, what was really great to see was the way they won the game at the end. They're down to 14 men. There's no doubt Ulster didn't do enough to win the match. Ultimately, they only scored 6 points against 14 men. And there's a story here about how much Ulster left this one behind. It's like they were so fired up, they were almost better off against 15 men, because then when they're up, you see Simon Zebo getting sent off, and they've got 65 minutes left. They go, oh, we should really win from here. And it seems like they got a little bit frozen headlights. They kicked poorly entering the last 10 minutes. You have the overcooked box kick by Nathan Doak, which Mike Haley fields. And then the game pivots entirely on Michael Larry at a fine game. He miscues that up and under, which Chris Farrell fields in the halfway line. And there's about 7 minutes left on the clock. And 15 phases later, Munster have scored through Alex Kendall. And there was some lovely moments in the build-up to that, which shows that even 14 against 15, they do have the skills. There was the offload to Mike Haley by Jack O'Donoghue, and Haley's lovely little step past Nick Timoney. There was a magnificent offload by Gavin Coombs to Josh Wycherley in the middle. Then there was the Jack O'Donoghue break. Then there was another offload by, I think it was Ben Healy to Finian Wycherley. And then Wycherley goes to the line. And Alex Kendall has like real presence of mind and a skill set to just grab that ball one-handed that popped up and plunged the line. So the pick and jam, ironically, then worked to the end. But they played some great rugby from going for the halfway line all the way up to there, which shows they do have the skills to not just go one off like they did against Connacht. And they've got, you're right, like Connacht were defending with 14 men, and Connacht would have wanted Munster to attack that narrowly. They wouldn't have wanted them to go wide, and it suited Connacht, it suited their defence, and they got a turnover penalty just before half-time, which was almost as good as a converted try to Connacht, because Munster's attack was so narrow and so restrictive. But this way, I think it did seem to me like they did learn their lessons a little bit. They did use their entire team, and they did play some really good rugby, which shows they have the skill set. I mean, like Gavin Coombs had one offload to Josh Wycherley in the middle of the pitch. It's just stunning. The best will in the world, it just wasn't part of CJ Stander's repertoire. So it actually there is an enhanced skill set, I think, with this new breed of forwards coming through in Munster as well, and they should use them. And they have, and hopefully they've now learned a lesson from both last week against Connacht and this week against Ulster, that there's more to them when they get deep inside the opposition 22.
Yeah, because Fiona, certainly last week you were very pessimistic, like most onlookers, I think. Listening to Gerry there accentuate some of the positives. And there are more. I mean, for instance, you hope Joey Carberry comes back sooner rather than later. Simon Zebo has had no run in the team, effectively, you know, and you know, needs to get his fitness up and needs to get a run. But that could happen over the next couple of months. Keith Earls could get going as well. And maybe loosen, drop the handbrake a touch when it comes to offloads and some of the nice rugby Gerry talks about. And, they're effectively through to the knockout stages of Europe. Like, the amount of money invested here, they should still be unbelievably competitive. So are you a touch more glass half full than you were last week? Or are you still kind of sitting there with your arms crossed thinking, I don't like the way this is all headed?
No, that's like, it was the last try of the game. It completely excited me seeing that style of rugby. That's what I've been crying out for, and we saw it in patches all season. Those offloads by Coombs, everything. It was brilliant to watch. I thought Mike Haley had an absolutely brilliant game as well. I know Ty Byrne got man of the match, but when we got the ball, he attacked. He wasn't just looking to kick up the field. That's the rugby we're crying out for, and they showed us that they can do it. Thomas Ahern, that had a beautiful line-out steal as well late in the second half. They just have it in them, and I suppose it's when we see glimpses and you get so excited as a Munster fan seeing that style of rugby. We've seen other teams play like that. We've talked about Connacht all season playing like that, and Munster have shown that when they do it, and they can score tries with that, but it's trying to get them to play a little bit more like that, because as Gerry said, the further you go and when you get into Europe and you're playing those big teams, you need to have big powerful packs, but when you're playing those French teams, it's backline attack. That's where you're going to need to execute. And we saw they have that interlinking between those forwards and backs. The skill set, you wouldn't have been able to tell who was forward, who was a back at times in that last phase attack for that try. So it's I suppose, Joe, it's showing us that a lot more in games is what we want. And that's the type of rugby that excites fans. And they've shown us at times, as I said, over the season, they can do it. We just need to see a little bit more of it.
Gerry, I mentioned Zebo. He only got 15 minutes on the pitch. I thought Jack Crowley might have been in a spot of bother as well for a moment, but ultimately Zebo was the chief offender. The referee, Mike Adamson, was talking about things like coming from distance, and it was a dynamic situation, and therefore I'll mitigate the offence to a yellow. It seemed like it was Brian McNeice, the TMO, to the rescue here.
Yeah, it did, no doubt about it. He was veering toward the yellow, Mike Adamson, initially, and then he was steered more towards a red, and no doubt it was a red card, shoulder to head. I remember the Wasp captain getting a red card against Munster, and there was a debate in the TV studios that he shouldn't have got one. I don't know why the debate has almost changed a little bit in the last 3 or 4 months in this. 3-4 months ago, there would have been no hesitation about these being red cards. And I thought that was the whole point of the exercise, that we're now really trying much harder to protect players from head knocks. And the shoulder to the head is just a red card. End of story. The head is sacrosanct. And yep, it was a red card. We all know that Simon Zebo isn't a malicious, dirty player, that he wouldn't have done that intentionally at all. He just isn't a malicious or dirty player. He just seems to be having the season from hell at the moment. What was that, his 4th game for Munster since he's come back from wrestling? And we're in January, and now he's facing a suspension. He's had 3 weeks in an Irish camp with no games. He's had 2 weeks in a quarantine in an hotel, or 10 days in South Africa. The poor lad can't catch a break. And it was a red card, no doubt. I just hope that his luck turns from now on for the rest of the season. I really do.
Announced today he's one of 6 to have signed a 2-year extension at Munster. So he'll have the next 2 years at least beyond this season, and hopefully it does turn for him. I want to get a final word from you both on how you see the Champions Cup at the weekend. Before that, Fiona, just on Ulster. So mitigation here as well is that they've had a COVID outbreak and they've had their struggles over the last couple of weeks, and the Leinster game and the Connacht game were cancelled. They pitched up here at Thomond Park, and as you mentioned, did very well in the first 20 minutes. It looked for all the world like they had taken the game plan from the RDS against Leinster, where they just held onto the ball and kept it narrow and short one-off runners and tried to transplant it onto Thomond again, keep it tight in that way. Should they have gone for it a bit more when Munster went into 14? Surely there would have been more space, or what was your sense of Ulster in the stadium?
That's exactly what I thought, Joe. I thought they should have really put the foot down and gone for it. The minute Zebo was gone, you could see there was at times as well where Munster were kind of making decisions on the scrum defensively, I think once they took off Hodnett and then they gave away a scrum penalty, so then they were bringing them back into the scrum. So when Munster done that from scrum, they had space out wide, and it absolutely baffled me how they didn't seem to exploit that, especially off set piece. They still went very, very narrow, and there was absolutely acres of space, and you could see Munster, they really worked hard to defend that. Haley and Sean Friends, and then Shane Daly came in as well, and there was a lot of chat going on there. You had the lads and Casey in the backfield as well, but it just I really thought Ulster will be going away shaking their heads. They absolutely let it slip away from them. I thought it was there for the taking. if they played that rugby that day. I know against Leinster they didn't, but I've seen them playing in European games, and they have the lads on the wing. I mean, Hume as well was another player. I know he got injured and he was a big loss to them, but he wasn't even getting the ball in space. They were keeping it very, very narrow, and he's an exciting player. They needed to really to attack that space that Zebo had left, and it didn't happen. And I think they'll look back at that video and they'll definitely think that they left it behind. It wasn't that Munster were absolutely outstanding. They had heart, they had passion, and they played great rugby at times, but I really felt like Ulster didn't. They played way too conservatively.
Okay, we're talking with Fiona Hayes and Gerry Thornley. Our rugby coverage and Off the Ball brought to you by Vodafone, official sponsor of the Irish rugby team of us, everyone in. Gerry, on Friday, Munster in Castres, that's an 8 o'clock kick-off, so Munster in France. Saturday, Connacht at home to Leicester, 3:15, and then on the Sunday, Leinster have Montpellier at the RDS, and then Ulster are in Franklin's Gardens away to Northampton, 3:15. Clean sweep for Ireland there, Gerry.
If they all go ahead, touch wood. All of the vagaries of COVID, obviously, particularly the Montpellier game, given their match against Toulouse last night, was postponed due to the outbreak of COVID in the Montpellier ranks. They only had 4 front row forwards and no tight heads, so that's why that game went. So hopefully that game will go out. Hopefully they all will. The competition needs it. It's a damaged brand this season again after last season. We've talked about this before, Joe. The new format doesn't help for sure. There seems to be wavering interest in the top 14 in the Premiership club towards this magnificent competition. Sadly, not everybody seems to love it as much as we do in Ireland. But yeah, it's good. It's going to be interesting. Starting with the Munster one, like Castres have won 4 in a row and have risen to 3rd in the top 14. They're having a good season. Don't play the most expansive or beautiful brand of rugby in the world, but they're very sticky. All their games are arm wrestles. They won 2 weeks ago in La Rochelle. Ohio West missed a penalty with the last kick of the game. They won that by a point. They won by a point the previous week. They beat Stade Francais at home by 15-9 in a trialist scrappy game at the weekend. And Stade had a 5-metre scrum with the last play of the game, which Castres survived. But they're a very nuggety team. They're very, they're good spoiling side, good defensively. They've strong set pieces. They've got a couple of game breakers in the couple of Fijians. Hosea Razuki, he's this winger who plays in the back row. He made an 80-metre break the other day. And they've a Fijian centre called Vinamoti Batitu. If those two are playing, that would be a signal of intent. It's a Friday night game. They're restricted to 5,000 fans as well. But you wouldn't have thought of looking at their style. I watched this game against Stade Francais. It looks to be way more. They certainly sound a lot more than 5,000 there. But they concentrated all 5,000 into one section of the ground, which would have thought defeated the purpose of the exercise.
I'm not sure that's the point.
In terms of social distancing. But there you go. It's certainly made for a better atmosphere. They'll be up for it Friday night game. We know Castres and Munster have met more often than either two teams in the history of the competition. It'll be a difficult game for Munster.
Okay, and then Connacht at home to Leicester. That's a really interesting game. You would suspect Leinster, if the Montpellier game goes ahead, will, with glee, with 28-0 in their minds, repeatedly stamp all over Montpellier and not quit until the end. And then Ulster away to Northampton. Northampton very poor thus far in the competition, and Ulster going along okay. What do you think, Fiona? I think there's half a chance of a clean sweep there.
Yeah, I think it's the Munster Cas game is the big one. It depends. Munster away over in France, it's going to be very, very tough. And as Gerry said, they've had 4 good games under their belt as well. They've been playing very, very good rugby at times. I watched that La Rochelle game as well, and I think they were about 17-0, maybe a bit more down, and they came back into that game as well. So they have exciting players, but very, very physical and set piece is really, really good. So that's going to be the sticky one. I think obviously Leicester are on the back of a loss as well, but we all know what that sports ground can do in that wind. So, and Connacht would be feeling very very positive after that Munster win, and it's not a great place to go, the sports ground. So that's another one you could have there. And I think Ulster and Leinster will have good enough wins. Northampton haven't been playing the best rugby, so it's the Connacht and Munster one, but definitely a possibility. I'll be positive today, Joe.
Okay, Fiona Hayes, thanks very much. Gerry Thornley, I'm sure you're writing about it all week in the Irish Times. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. We all belong to the team of us.